Again, thank you for joining us today for this AgrAbility webinar. Today we're going to be talking about international aspects of disability and agriculture. My name is Paul Jones. I'm the manager of the National AgrAbility Project at Purdue University. And our panelists today are from various areas and experiences. We have Mutumba Faisal from AgrAbility for Africa, who is headquartered in Uganda. Bill Field here from the National AgrAbility Project. Betty Rodriguez from North Carolina. And Ned Stoller from Michigan AgrAbility. Some of you may not be familiar with AgrAbility. We are sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture there. And we focus on accommodating issues of disability in agriculture. Every one of the AgrAbility projects around the country is a partnership between a land-grant university and at least one nonprofit disability services organization. Currently, there are 20 funded state projects around the country, plus some affiliate projects. And there's one National AgrAbility Project. Again, that's led by Purdue's Breaking New Ground Resource Center. And our partners on that grant include Goodwill of the Finger Lakes, APRIL, which is the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living, Colorado State University, and Washington State University. For more information about AgrAbility, including over 90 archived webinars, you can go to agrability.org. We have a wealth of resources there, print publications that are available in PDF, contact information, and many other resources. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Ned Stoller, and Ned was actually the catalyst for this webinar. He has been taking charge of some of our international initiatives, and Ned is going to be talking a little bit more about his experiences and also about some of our presenters also. So Ned, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world. And we are looking forward to having a good conversation here about the international aspects of people with disabilities who are working in agriculture. And I'm going to share some experiences that I've had working with some farmers in central Mexico. And then I will pass the presentation on to Betty Rodriguez to speak of her experiences from Colombia. And then Mutumba will speak to us about his experiences and work in Africa, in Uganda. And then Bill Field will wrap things up and speak of his experiences in Europe. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Stop my video and share my screen, and we'll go through a short presentation from Michoacan, Mexico. So this was a trip that I took to central Mexico in January of 2020, and it tied right in with our work here at National AgrAbility on the International AgrAbility Network. Over the last number of years, there's been increasing interest from all around the world of other organizations and nations that are interested in serving people with disabilities in agriculture. And so we're developing this network to help share information and ideas how to serve people and develop low-tech assistive technology. So this network is full of people from many different groups, government agencies and missions and NGOs all around the world, all with the same goal. At the National Training Workshop last year, and it was intended for this year and hopefully still will be later in the year when we get together to have people from around the world that are able to come to the National Training Workshop and share with us. Mutumba is pictured here with one of his clients in Uganda. And the intent, the goal is, we're actually going to discuss it some more tomorrow, as more people around the world are interacting and solutions to problems are developed, low-tech assistive technology, which might include different methods, ways of doing the farming tasks for people in different situations, to start building that database in the toolbox at agrability.org, and so that people all around the world can learn from each other what types of equipment is being successfully used and methods there. So this is one of the major goals of the International AgrAbility Network and National AgrAbility. So this is a picture from Michoacan State in Mexico, and it was a very interesting place to visit. Some of it was very arid. This is a crop of agave, which is used to make tequila, and it was growing in the more arid regions of the state. This is alfalfa, a very lush field. It was along the lowlands getting closer over towards Mexico State, towards Mexico City. And so there was mountains and there was plains, there was volcanic soils, just a huge variety of agriculture. Up in the mountains, they were harvesting pitch from the pine trees to make turpentine. You could see the little cup here that is fastened to the tree to catch the pitch as it would drip out on hot days, and people would go through the forests and gather this. And there was very, very high-tech agriculture there. Also, there was, I've never seen so many high tunnel greenhouses, and this was to provide shade for the strawberries. There was fields, acres and acres and acres, strawberries grown, and blackberries and raspberries and tomatoes under these high tunnels. And right across the street, there was a person milking a cow by hand. We also saw a huge four-wheel drive John Deere tractor leveling out the land for putting in more hoop houses, and donkey carts pulling loads down the street. So there's quite a variety of agriculture and livelihoods represented here in this state. Michoacan is about as far south as Mexico City. It's farther to the west. It's near the city of Guadalajara. I had the opportunity to work with a farmer for a day. He had a vision impairment, and so he was unable to drive his tractor. I would say that he was probably right in the middle of the spectrum as far as the size and scope of his farm. He owned one tractor, farmed about 50 acres, and he could produce a crop of corn. He would plant the corn in May and harvest it in November, pretty similar to us here in the Midwest of the United States. But then as soon as he was done harvesting his field of corn, he could plant wheat in December or January. And that's what was going on here. He's preparing to dig trenches across his field for surface irrigation. Due to his vision impairment, he's not able to drive his own tractor in the fields. He'd be unable to make straight passes back and forth. And so he would hire day workers to come out and work for him. It would be a 6-hour shift, and they would get paid $11 for a 6-hour shift working for him. This worker was unfamiliar with the particular trenching machine on this tractor. And this was a conversation that went on for about an hour and a half, trying to convince this worker that indeed this trenching machine would work. And ultimately, he wouldn't use it, and we had to go find a different machine that he was familiar with before he would drive the tractor. So that was a challenge. I did learn just the cultural challenges and differences as we interact with people around different parts of the world. The cultural concerns play a big role in helping someone with a disability accommodate. This is a picture of the trenches that would be dug with the tractor, and then the water flows from one ditch, one larger irrigation ditch on one side of the field through these trenches, and then the wheat is actually sown over the surface of the field. In this picture, this is actually what I helped work with throughout the day. The farmer had planted his wheat, but the grain drill he had used did not put enough seed out. And so he had hired day workers to come and actually walk his 50 acres and scatter seed by hand to increase the pounds of seed per acre that was in the field. And these 50-pound bags of seed wheat hanging over the worker's shoulder, I could see it was cutting in to the shoulder, and that's what I experienced also. So right there out in the edge of the field, there was a empty fertilizer bag, paper bag laying there. We picked it up and rolled it up and made a pad for our shoulders just to reduce the pain from that heavy bag of wheat seed cutting into our shoulders. That was just a simple accommodation. We went back into town at one point. The trenching machine, we were going to try to modify the trenching machine so that the day worker would be willing to use it. And we went to the local welding shop in the town of Ixtlan, and we found that there was a moderate availability of steel, square steel tubing and angle iron. In this picture, the welder is actually building an irrigation pump. He had cut a section of pipe into thirds and was welding it on to be the flanges of the pump. And so we visited with him for a while. Here's some other projects that he had going on, building steps. So this was something for us to think about as we would try to help people around the world, is to be aware of what is appropriate technology in their region. So just looking at the materials available and the welding shop and the tools that he had available to him would impact what recommendations we would make for assistive technology that could help the farmers. Outside the welding shop was a chair made out of rebar that they would weave or put wood on to make the seat. And I noticed that all around central Mexico, there was rebar everywhere available. And so after spending the day with this farmer and just thinking with him about accommodations for his work, he took me and introduced me to two more agricultural workers. One was a day worker who would drive tractor for people, but his back hurt so bad from twisting in the seat, and it was difficult for him to climb on and off of the tractors. And so knowing that there was rebar available, I came home, or I got back to Michigan, and I thought about how could this day worker, who every single day of the week he might go work for a different farmer. And so attaching a step permanently onto a tractor was not a good solution for his assistive technology. And so I used rebar, and I built this step stool with a handle that he would be able to climb up on a tractor, get up to the first step anyway, and then pull this stool up behind him with the handle. So with appropriate assistive technology, the materials would be available in his region of the world. The local fabricators would be able to copy this concept and build it for him for a reasonable price that he would be able to afford. Another thing was this rear view mirror. I noticed that there was quite a few older vehicles around, and places where you could get used parts off of vehicles. And this Ford van mirror worked very well for making a rear view mirror for a tractor. I used angle iron and rebar to fabricate this extension mirror that could clamp onto whatever tractor that day worker would need to go use for the day, so that he could have a rear view mirror without hurting his back. This is a fold-up step that could also be clamped on or moved from tractor to tractor. It folds up, and when it's in the up position, it rests on the step above. So if there's another worker who didn't need to use the fold down step, he could just use the tractor steps as normal. But if this day worker needed it, he could flip the step down and climb up onto the tractor and then tug the rope and fold it up. So these are just a few examples. My experience was a good one there, just to realize the importance of learning the culture of the workers and the availability of materials and fabricators and what tools and equipment they would have available for building the assistive technology. So if you have any questions about this, we'll take questions at the end of the presentation, and I will pass the presentation on to Betty now.
Good morning, I'm Betty Rodriguez with North Carolina AgrAbility, and today I'm going to be talking about what agriculture and disabilities looks in Colombia. I'm originally from Colombia, and so this is my experience when I traveled in 2018. Well, I'm going to talk about Colombia and agriculture disabilities in general, and about my visit to Cali, Colombia in December 2018, when I got a chance to share information about what we do here in AgrAbility. And a minute, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, so basically, Colombia, well, is the first country in South America when you come from North America. So we have the north, the Atlantic Ocean to the north, and then the Pacific Ocean. And these are like the division of, this is the division of the land by climate. And as you see on the right-hand side, is very, the two regions in green are flat regions where we have the mountain range is on the central part. And that's where the majority of agriculture takes place. The Caribbean is mostly a touristic area, and the Pacific, we have a lot of, underdeveloped, very poor infrastructure region. And so Colombia is a middle income country in South America, GDP 377 billion. In 2014, we had 48 million inhabitants. 74 years is the life expectancy. And we're a very poor country, like there's very huge differences, but 28.5% of people live below the poverty line. And the official census for people with disabilities is 6.4%, but some organizations, they think the real count should be 15%. And this is something, you know, the pictures you see here are on those very, very extensive areas of flat land on the eastern of the country, where the climate there is like 6 months. We don't have seasons because we're in the tropic. So down there is just winter, what we call winter and summer, which is 6 months of dry time and then 6 months of rains. And that's what you see on the bottom, like they have to move cattle from one pasture to another and cross the creeks. Okay, so the distribution of land, the use of land. So we're in Colombia, they don't use all the land that is apt for agriculture. And the reason is because like the cost of feeding animals is very high because Colombia don't produce all the feed that is needed and rely a lot on the imports. The production units, so we see that small farms, less than 5 hectares, are 70% of the land, and larger farms are 0.4, so it's few units, but a large area. And in livestock, mostly, you know, 80%, the land is used in livestock a lot, but really it's not that productive. So here is a cute picture of a small farmer, and the livestock production accounts for 9% of our GDP. So some of the main issues in Colombia are poverty, insecurity, high cost of inputs, transportation, unfair competition. And the reason for this is because, you know, more developed countries have subsidies in agriculture. So sometimes what we produce in Colombia is, the cost to produce is very, very high. So it's better to import. And lack of infrastructure. So here is the graph of disabilities by economic activity. So we have here like row crops is the second one here, where we say agricola is like row crops, fruits and vegetables. So disabilities in that sector are higher. So if we see the last one on the road is, let me show you the next slide here. So the larger disability is in the manufacturing industry with 25%, and like row crops and fruits and vegetables is 24%. Animal production is 1%. So it's, well, it says that it's not that much. Disability by origin of disability. So a general disease is the largest one. And then we also have, I want to show you here, the, well, the second one is an accident, due by accident, and the armed conflict is the fourth before the last one. And so the next slide shows like the distribution of that armed conflict. And then by firearms is the largest one. And the landmines is the next one. But when we see, if you look on the right little chart here, is showing that the ones that were included in this census, where it says C, is 1,381, where it says no, which is that they didn't respond back to this particular census that they did, is 13,000. So the total landmine victims are 14,000, which is a little bit larger. Though that's not the #1 cause of disability in Colombia. So here is the Cauca Valley, which is the region where Cali is, and we call it department. It's like the state, but we're not independent. So it's a mountain range where almost, the large city is Cali and other cities, but the region on the Pacific Ocean is the most socially underdeveloped and economically. So there's a lot of social and economic inequalities, and there's diverse microclimates. So here I have the main disabilities in the Cauca Valley. So number one are movement, neurological is the next, and the next is cardiorespiratory disabilities. And so the agricultural production in the valley is mostly the agro-industrial sector. So it's in the sugarcane, basically, as you can see on the bottom right-hand side chart. And for non-agro-industrial, number one is fruits and trees and plantain. But that's, so these are some photos of what the sugarcane production is. And usually is the, use the flat lands in the valley, and it's more high technology, though they still do burn the sugarcane for harvesting. And they still use a lot of seasonal workers to harvest manually. So they do these burnings and wait till they cool, dry, and then the people gets in and start. And there's several reasons for doing that way, but it's a lot of seasonal workers there. And this is like the processing plant, and on the right up, this picture is the transportation of the sugarcane to the industrial plant. And these are, kind of other crops, fruits, pineapple. They use this conveyor to help farm workers. It's really good because they don't have to bend down that much. And grape crops and coffee and passion fruit. Okay, so some resources for rehabilitation in Colombia are rehabilitation clinics, disability organizations, and the universities. So this is a book that talks about disabilities in Colombia. The disability rate was 6.3%. This was 2015. And they have implemented a community-based rehabilitation metrics from the World Health Organization and provide reparation and rehabilitation services for those individuals affected by the armed conflict. And there was a lot of people who was displaced from the rural areas, so they have to move to the larger cities, and that increased the unemployment. And there's a lot of rehabilitation clinics there, but I couldn't see like a relationship between that much about disabilities in agriculture specifically. And these are some of the disability organizations. Some of them provide resources about, getting maybe resources for their disability, and they link resources in organizations. Zero Limits Foundation, institutions for the blind and deaf. And some of the concerns are that there's lack of resources for people with disabilities, and many of them have to rely on the Teleton, but they see that, people with disabilities is seen as objects of charity. Okay, so my meeting with the professors at the University of Universidad del Valle in Cali, Colombia, was in December 2018, and I met with some professors and Dr. Jose Ignacio Garcia Melo, was one of the authors of this article here, and they designed and developed an implementation for a technology device for shoulder rehabilitation via the internet. And they make reference to the disabilities in the body, arm, hands, and legs as 21% nationally and 35% in the Cauca Valley. Methods of rehabilitation, medications, physical medicine, physiotherapy, which the larger ones is medication. Quality of the rehabilitation was affected by lack of money to travel, lack of companion, and the distance from the care center. So in this article, Dr. Jose Ignacio Melo and the other authors, what they did was like a power unit and an assistive technology device. So it was composed of these two parts. And they could place one part on the patient, and then he can be, remotely receiving that rehabilitation via internet. And the benefits is that it's safe and synchronous operation. They can trace the treatment and monitor the progress of those variables. So these are some of the, when we say lack of transportation, if you look here on, this is Cali, the main city, and all this area in red is the Pacific area, which is Buenaventura, the main city, and then the other small towns are very isolated. So when Buenaventura and Cali, they have good transportation, though it's very lengthy. It takes like about 3.5 hours to go from Buenaventura to Cali. So other places there, they transport, this is called the wedge transportation, which uses the railroad tracks that are not in use anymore in Colombia. So they put some handmade carts there, which is called wedge transportation. And they only go one way. So when they get to the place, they turn it. They lift it and turn it and then put the next load of people in that cart. So for someone with a disability, you can imagine how it is to getting those. Okay, so we're gonna leave the questions for the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Betty. We'll now go to Mutumba, and I am going to share my screen. I have Mutumba's presentation here, and Mutumba will go ahead and do his presentation. Did we lose Mutumba?
Ned, it looks like he may have lost his connection. So
Okay.
I think what we'll do for the time being, until he is able to rejoin us, is to go ahead and let Dr. Field talk a little bit about his experiences, and then hopefully Mutumba will be able to reconnect here.
Okay. We'll turn it over to Bill.
Okay, can you all see me? I wanted to pass along a private joke to Brad, who's on the line, I think, that this is actually Bill Field doing a Zoom meeting. I think it's my 5th one this week, so they're really stretching me during this COVID-19 period. I want to thank those that were a part of this, putting this together, especially Paul, who's handled the technical issues, and Ned, who's been pushing us to do it, and for Betty for being a part of it, and Mutumba, who is working, I'm sure, desperately to try to reconnect with us. We worked yesterday to try to make all this happen, and this morning, and it just sometimes are out of our control, but I know he really wanted to be a part of this. I wanted to, again, start off by indicating that the disability community represents the largest underserved population in the world. And I think the data clearly shows that if you wanted to look at it in depth. Some agencies such as the World Bank and other groups suggest that as much as 1 out of 5 of the world's residents are unable to do essential daily tasks because of a disability. And in some parts of the world, it's even much higher than that. I wanted to echo Betty's comments that some recent reading I've done in Southeast Asia looks at the high number of rural residents who have been impacted by landmines, and that there is literally thousands of individuals who have had lower limbs lost due to contact with landmines that were planted there 40 years ago during the Vietnam era, and that they're still occurring in some of those parts of the world. So those are kinds of thoughts that people don't really give much consideration to. But this group is often overlooked in the cultural and the social and the economic and political corners, and you often don't see much attention given to it. And I think one of the items that I've gotten from reading through this literature is that there's a sense that this problem is almost overwhelming, and so let's focus on things that maybe we can do something about. But I do believe that that there is a tremendous need there, and that there could be a lot done using locally available resources to enhance the quality of life of people with disabilities. I think if you look at it historically, a lot of this work has been done by faith-based humanitarian institutions that have been committed to the quality of life of people. And I just throw out a couple of examples. Some of you are familiar with groups like Easter Seal, Goodwill, Red Cross, many of them having faith-based origins to work with people that had special needs. You look at the work of Albert Schweitzer in Africa, if you want to read his books or read stories about him, very impressive on trying to improve the quality of life of people that he worked with. I throw out Dr. Paul Brandt, who spent most of his professional career working with leprosy in both India and throughout the world, trying to provide vocational training to those that were impacted by this terrible disease at the time called leprosy. And then another example I wanted to use is the Free Wheelchair Mission, which is an agency that has provided last July their 1 millionth free wheelchair without any cost to the recipient. I had the opportunity to observe in Trivandrum, India, the assembly of 800 wheelchairs in 3 days and distribution of every wheelchair to individuals who came and who had never owned a wheelchair, had never had an opportunity to have the mobility that a wheelchair provides, and to leave there with a free wheelchair, including a wrench and an air compressor, handheld air compressor to keep their wheelchair in operation. And it's just incredible to think about 1 million wheelchairs being distributed and not even being a drop in the bucket in the world today. So I think that there's no question that the need there again continues to be very great. There are many people working on these issues, often alone or with very limited budgets. I think of the work that I was able to do with Dr. Wu, who was taking used soda pop containers, 2-liter bottles and 1-liter bottles, and converting them into upper limb prosthetic devices. I think of Therese Wilkham and her work to groups around the world on low-tech solutions. I think of a machine shop that I worked in north of Trivandrum, India, that had internet connection, was able to bring up the AgrAbility website and saw some of the concepts, some of the ideas, and was convinced that he could make those locally, and just put him to work right away and trying to make some of these adaptions that he had never been exposed to before. So I would encourage you to do a little reading on this subject and see that, for example, the struggles that some agencies have. My most recent event that I participated in was an international conference on AT in Italy, and it was easily seen by everybody that the facility that we were in was not accessible. In fact, it was difficult to get a wheelchair in. It was difficult to get in and out some of the meeting rooms because it was an old facility. And yet here was an international meeting on AT that was struggling with accessibility issues. I think of the first time I visited Sweden and was told that there were no disabled farmers in Sweden, and then began to take to the road, and within a short period of time was introduced to several farm families that had similar disabilities to people we work with in the States, and then bringing over an engineer to work with Life Essentials here in Lafayette or north of Lafayette, and them basically stealing all the ideas and returning back to Sweden. And the last time I've heard, they've built about 20 lifts for tractors, and that they had a waiting list to produce additional adaptations for not only farm equipment, but also their homes. And I was able to follow up. I've made 4 or 5 trips there to look at how that's impacted individual families and how it's made it easier for them to save their land and to save their family operations because of simple forms of AT. One of the visions that I have personally is I'm approaching pretty much the end of my career, but I still have a lot of energy, and that is how can we impact the world with AgrAbility services and resources and content that's been developed. And I think one of the most powerful tools we have is the AgrAbility website. If you haven't visited the website, www.agrability.org, it's something we're incredibly proud of. It's something that I think USDA, NIFA should be incredibly proud of. We're getting literally thousands of visitors every day to the website. Last year there was some 800 and some thousand pages that were viewed, and we had representation from 118 countries that utilized the website, and often it's somewhat paralleling the events that we've been able to participate in some parts of the world. So I see some opportunities here, and I'm going to just share a few things, and hopefully we can get Mutumba back on, and then we can finish up with him. But one item is I encourage all AgrAbility staff to take the opportunity to do an international event. Sign up with some humanitarian group, sign up with a USAID program or something where you can take your skill sets to a part of the world, and you're going to find, as Ned found, how easy it is to begin to enhance the quality of life of people through the ideas that are already between your ears, things that you can easily guide someone to do. Being an old shop teacher for 6 years, way back in my career, it just gave me really a passion to be able to go into a shop and show things that could be done. And I know Ned has that capacity too. And many of you, like what Betty is doing in Colombia, I just think is incredible. And I would like to see more AgrAbility staff just expand their experiences by doing that. I also suggest that we try to expand our outreach with our mailing list. We now have probably 500 or so international contacts that have reached us or reached out to us or attended the NTW or have participated in other ways, and now we're doing some special mailings to them. Ned is helping coordinate those through a newsletter, and it's exciting to see some dialogue. I was just really excited to see an Argentinian surgeon contact us about working with some farmers who had lost both legs in farm accidents. And I think that's really incredibly cool to see those relationships building into very practical applications. I also would encourage all of you to consider, from an international perspective, looking for ways to bring some international friends to the NTW. We're still scheduled for November 30th. We're hoping things are going to cool down. We're going to be in Madison, Wisconsin. We're driving ahead with all anticipation and hope this will be our 28th of these events. We sure don't want to become chilly toward it at all. We're kind of excited. Our planning meetings are being held, and so we're hoping that we can pull together a crowd. We had 240 some pre-registered for the event before we had to cancel it here a few weeks ago, and we're just sort of driving on and hoping that things will get better. So I'm delighted that you're all here. We're here for you, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us, and we look forward to it. So I guess we got Mutumba back on the line from Uganda, which is an incredible blessing or an opportunity. So.
Okay, thank you, Bill. And Mutumba, I can bring up your presentation if you would like.
Sure, I'll go. Can I go ahead now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, depending on your time zone. It's good to connect with you. I've been having trouble with the internet connection. That's why I come on and off. But hopefully, I'll be okay. I'll manage to go through my presentation without having issues with the internet. So I'll straight away jump into my presentation. I'm going to talk about the state of rehabilitation services in Africa. I'll start with definition of rehabilitation. It's a branch of medicine that aims to enhance and restore functional ability and the quality of life to people with physical impairment and disabilities. Basically occupational, which is vocational, then physical and speech. My focus today is going to be physical rehabilitation and vocational rehabilitation. I'll go down to the next slide. I want to take you through the need, why it's important for agriculture-focused rehabilitation programs. A small background on the state and the figures. By World Health Organization, only 2% of disabled individuals access rehabilitation services, while only 1 to 2 individuals every 10 people access rehabilitation services in Africa. And if you look at the figures of the farmers, because of the isolation of their locations and their rural communities, a chance for a rural farmer in Africa with a disability to meet a physician who specializes in appropriate care is basically zero. That implies that over 60% of the population in Africa is employed in agriculture, and majority of that is isolated in rural communities. So basically, majority of them, when faced with a disability, they have zero access to vocational rehabilitation that will enable them to get back to their farms. And when you look at the entire the prevalence rates of disabilities in Africa, currently it's about 80% of people faced with disabilities in the world. They live in low-income countries, and that is majority. And many of them you can find in sub-Saharan Africa. I'll move on to the next slide to show you the skilled. Basically, skilled professionals in rehabilitation care compared to the population. If you look at this graph, you'll focus on the blue dots. These the low and lower middle income countries. Because if you look at, you realize that in every 1 billion, basically you find one skilled rehabilitation professional for every 1 million people in these lower and middle income countries. I'll take you to the next slide, and you look at the density, the comparison density of speech and language therapies. When you look at majority at the end of this diagram, you look at countries like Tanzania, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Madagascar, Ghana, Swaziland. So you find majority of these countries don't even have a single speech or language therapist for the entire countries. So when faced with disabilities other than those that are not associated with mobilities, chances of connecting or getting access to a rehabilitation expert is almost zero as well. So this is basically the state of physical and rehabilitation medicine. Rehabilitation services and devices. The role of rehabilitation, basically, it's majority of rehabilitation needs when you go to these institutions those that are carrying out help orthopedics surgeons. So basically, they handle all rehabilitation-related cases. And which we look at the state of rehabilitation in a big part of Africa it is institutionalized and focused on physical rehabilitation. And our focus, or the focus of AgrAbility in Africa is interested more in vocational rehabilitation. Basically, support for people to get back into good health and be able to get back into work. So I'll go on to the next slide. So I'll share with the slide with the AgrAbility team in Indiana. Anyone who needs to look further into the details can access it. So we are looking at the capacity for these small and medium enterprises who make up majority of the farmers in Africa. We are looking at their capacity to pay for the rehabilitation services and devices. If you look at the right of your screen, there's a small diagram there by the International Fund for Agriculture and Development. It shows you the acreage that is farmed by majority of the smallholder farmers. If you look at this, an average farm size for a smallholder is 5 acres, and it is non-mechanized. It is rain-fed agriculture. A big part of agriculture in Africa is rain-fed, and they don't receive any subsidies. And if you look at the farm yield, an average farmer earnings in Africa is about 500 per hectare per year. That's the earnings from their farm yield. Because the farm yield production, most of the land is contaminated, and there's little application of fertilizers. So in comparison to production farm yield in like Midwest states in America, which is about 10% per acre, which is about 10 tons per acre of corn yield, and an average farm in Africa, it's especially when you look at East and Central Africa, the yield per hectare of corn is about 2.5 tons, and in comparison to the US, I think it averages about 10 tons per hectare. And if you look at laborers in Africa, farm laborers in Africa, they earn about $1 a day. So these figures clearly show you that many of these farmers or farm laborers, when they're faced with needs of rehabilitation services or care, or need to purchase these devices, many of them are unable to pay for these devices or these rehabilitation services. So I'll move on to the next slide. So when you look at the demand of assistive technologies and devices in Africa, so you look at this taking to an estimation big, and I'm using this because currently there is no accurate data, credible data to clearly show you the actual demand of or need of rehabilitation services and these assistive technology devices. But taking into a world estimate, about 6% of every population in the developing world is in need of a wheelchair or lacks access to it. That means, for example, Uganda has demand of about 1.5 million wheelchairs to accurately meet its demand. There's lack of state funding, nationwide delivery systems, and the big challenge is that most of these healthcare budgets of many of these African states are met by grants or donations from United States Agency for International Development or Bill Miranda, Gates Foundation, and other international donor aid agencies. So if you look at their missions, many of them have targeted areas or sectors they basically have interest in. So, and if you look at them like Bill Miranda, USAID, their focus is on HIV, tuberculosis, hepatitis B, basically top infectious diseases. So that's where they focus all their resources, because and government has little say in choice of all their allocation or how they allocate their resources. Basically, I mean, decisions are made in either England or Washington, D.C. on what should be funded. So there's little resources that goes into rehabilitation services. So I'll move on to the next slide. So if you look at the current situation where people are able to get some help, sources for help for rehabilitation services or assistive technology devices, Dr. Field mentioned faith-based organization. I think they're the largest source of help into the area of rehabilitation and assistive technology. A lot of credit goes to them. They are doing a lot of great work to support people faced with disabilities in many corners of Africa. Then there's international organization, other non-government organizations, charity organizations, like then church, those faith-based organization is the greatest, I think, source for this support in areas of rehabilitation and assistive technology. I will move on to the next slide. Basically, we analyze the major gaps in rehabilitation across Africa. So there's, I'll start with there's poor, limited data available to accurately estimate the needs and demand. Then there's this lack of unified national strategy for assistive technology, resulting in two poorly defined roles among government entities. Basically, no coordination and program and budget allocation that goes into assistive technology or rehabilitation. Fragmented procurement with heavy reliance on contributions from donors, charities, and non-government organizations, including the faith-based organization, lack of weak standards and regulation for assistive technology, product and services. And we'll see later on the effects of lack of regulations and standards, the insufficient workforce availability and capacity to provide assistive technologies, then funding participation of people with disabilities might thus be considered to be more charitable or humanitarian response. So basically, sadly, many people here look at disabilities or support for people faced with disabilities as a charity. Many don't see it as a right for these people for equal access. I mean, providing accessibility services to people faced with these challenges, which is a big problem also. So I will go on to the next slide. Then, so like I mentioned earlier, because many of these rehabilitation or assistive technology needs are met by faith-based organizations and other people. So decisions they make of equipment, some of it which is recycled, and there's little participation of experts and assistive technology or rehabilitation experts. So you find the load shipments, full container shipments of these devices or wheelchairs, among other things. Then they'll ship them back here. Then they'll go up in different communities and pass on these equipment to these people with little participation of experts or little involvement of recipients. So then you realize there's little considerations of limitations, need of recipients, and environmental requirements of these recipients of the AT equipment. So this you find that have caused a huge problem. That's why you realize there's a high abandonment rate of these assistive technology devices, because you realize some of them they are meant to be to improve the quality of life of these people, but because lack of involvement of experts and rehabilitation experts in these donational programs or aid programs, you realize many of these devices end up causing a lot of secondary injuries to these recipients. So it shows you the importance of involving many of these professionals, rehabilitation and AT experts to work alongside these international the national arrangements or program or these donor organization. So so I'll move on to the next slide. So this slide shows you what we are trying to do. We are trying to advance community-based rehabilitation strategy, where we shift this intervention from institutions to the homes and the communities of these people. That way we are able to assess the needs, then involve the recipients or the clients in this rehabilitation process, understand their needs and the environmental needs, so we can basically design a program or intervene appropriately to avoid abandonment rate of treatment or any help that might be forwarded to the person faced with these challenges. With activities, develop service capacity through educational activities, encouraging networking, and provide directed services of assessment and try to find solutions to needs of these people. And AgrAbility Program in Indiana is doing a great job trying to understand low-cost solutions that are in different parts of Africa, all different corners of the world, then put them together through a low-cost assistive toolbox that you can access and look through at the AgrAbility.org website. This is a great tool to try to increase access and awareness of these low-cost assistive technologies around the world. So I will go on to the last slide. It shows you some of these low interventions and solutions. That this is one of our clients in Uganda. Is a gentleman. Is about 45 years old. He's sadly he's a victim of HIV, but because of the conditions, he's forced to go out in his garden. But over time, he was faced with challenges of musculoskeletal issues because of lack of involvement or awareness of ergonomics during the work hall design. So we realized he was having problems with his back. Then we recommended, on the right of the screen is the recommendation of a longer handle for his hoe. So when we replaced the shorter handle on the left side with the longer handle on the right side, over time, after a couple months, we returned to his home and asked him about the condition and how he's faring. And then good news was the longer handle is improving his health and he's having few issues with his back and is able to return to his farm. So this is kind of spread out to many parts of Africa. I return the audience back to John. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mutumba. And we'll turn it back over to Paul now for closing comments.
Okay. And again, we thank you for your participation there. We do have a question in the chat area, which I will, and then again, there's your poll results for that. Thank you. Question in the chat area, I will throw out to anyone, any of our participants, or rather our panelists. 3D printing is showing promise in developing countries for agriculture. Is this something that the speakers have seen? Any comments from any of our panelists there?
Hello, Bree. Thank you for that question. And I was actually looking forward to your presentation at the National Training Workshop on this topic. I have not worked with 3D printing, so that's an area that we could be educated on and what you have experienced.
I've seen quite a bit of information on the internet, especially about printing prosthetic devices, especially prosthetic hands. I think when we worked with the Northwestern Prosthetic and Orthotic Group out of Northwestern and Chicago, Evanston. Their main concern of those was durability of some of those 3D printed devices. That was several years ago, but
Bree, would you like to share any comment on that, on the 3D printing?
I could unmute you if you would like to do that, I think. And you are unmuted if you do want to comment.
So you can hear me?
Can hear you.
Okay. Yes. So I am hoping to present if we go through for the next conference in the fall. So what's really neat about it is that it's very inexpensive to set up a 3D printer, and you can actually literally make the 3D printer. And as you're making the 3D printer, then people really know how to fix their 3D printer, because I have one, and you're constantly tweaking it. So it's economical. It's not too difficult to make a 3D printer itself. And then the price of like filament is really inexpensive. And because you can kind of tweak a design, I mean, what I've been reading is that people are more accepting of it. So, you know, they can make it just the way they need it for like their hand or their needs. So it's really promising. So there's actually a decent amount of information out there on it. So I would actually like to make my own 3D printer. I don't have time right now.
Oh, can I say something about it as well?
Please go ahead.
There's a lot of intervention with 3D printing. There's actually an organization that's doing great work in Uganda. And I connected with them. Basically, they run through whole rehabilitation programs at their facility, and I reached out to them, and they're willing to connect with us and provide especially non-paid for rehabilitation services and other rehabilitation interventions for children of farmers faced with disabilities. But sadly, the only challenge so far is their facilities, like many facilities I mentioned earlier, institutionalized and are located and taking up this little involvement or seeking support from this organization, because transportation is a huge problem for these rural farmers to come and go through the whole rehabilitation processes or evaluation or support for this organization. So we try to find ways of trying to ease this challenge of transportation for these rural farmers to access these interventions. But this great work this organization are doing to extend services at low cost, because maybe it's a donor-funded organization funded by some organization in Canada. So they provide some subsidies or low-cost rehabilitation interventions for people faced with disabilities, and many of children that you're able to bring to these facilities, they're provided at no-cost services. So 3D is really doing a great job to increase accessibility for these people faced with these challenges in many parts of Africa.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that discussion, comments. I think we are out of questions at this point in our chat room, and we're over time, as I mentioned. So again, thanks very much to everyone for participating. Thank you, Mutumba, for dialing in from Uganda. We appreciate your participation, and everyone else. So we will say good afternoon for us in the US, good evening for those in other parts of the world, and we hope that you will join us again for a future webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.